All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody, um, and welcome to the X Planes tour. It would be obviously so much better if we could have a live tour and we could walk around the museum for a little while, but conditions and such, that's just not going to um, happen. So I'm going to do my best to uh, take us through and show you some of the awesome uh, exhibits that are at the museum. So without too much further ado, also as a quick reminder, you can post questions to me over in the Q&A section. You can chat amongst yourselves and that kind of thing. But if you do have a question, go ahead and shoot that over into the Q&A. And towards the end of the presentation, I'll take a look at those and see what I can do to answer your questions and that kind of thing. All right, so let's get started. I'm going to follow the directions Todd gave me to see if we can light this place up a little bit. So I need to share that screen and I need to share my system audio and off we go. All right, so again, this presentation is called The X-Planes, the path to supersonic flight and the space program. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Dave Combs. I am the president of the Right Stuff Rocketeers. We are Section 703 in the Dayton area. I've been in the Dayton area all my life, and I am a huge, huge fan of and I almost called it what I always call it, the Air Force Museum. It is the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force. But when you've grown up next door to it and you visit it so many times and you're so familiar with it, it just comes out, it's the Air Force Museum. We absolutely love that place. And most of the exhibits that we're going to be talking about today are here in the new fourth building. On the picture, the one building on the farthest right or the lower right, that's the new fourth building. It was completed and open to the public in 2016. As the Rocketeers note, in between that and the third building is the high silo that holds the ICBMs and that kind of thing. Again, you've got to make it out here. You've got to see this thing. So what we're going to watch next is a quick video of the entire contents of the fourth building. It's 224,000 square feet of awesomeness, and it is, as it says, home to 4 groups of aircraft called galleries. It has the presidential aircraft, the Global Reach Gallery, which includes transports, heavy lift aircraft, and that kind of thing, the Research and Development Gallery, and the Space Gallery. And those are the ones that we're going to be focusing on most. So let's roll that video. Now that we're about halfway through the video, hopefully everybody can hear me. You can probably tell that this is drone footage. This is something that the museum has really put a lot of time and effort into. They have hired a drone flying person, and they have him go through the various exhibits and try to get both groups of aircraft or groups of exhibits, or he'll also um, take very extensive video of a particular aircraft or exhibit. Um, and all of those videos get posted out on YouTube. So if you want to take some time, oh, look at that. Look at that constellation. That's probably one of the prettiest airplanes ever made. But in any case, they're putting a lot of time and effort into, doing some fly arounds of these aircraft. And also they have a company that comes in with 360-degree cameras, and they'll put those cameras in the cockpits of the aircraft, and then you can take a 360-degree view around the whole aircraft. So it's a really, really cool thing to take a look at. So we're going to let this video get itself finished up. Here we are over the presidential gallery. That beautiful three-tail there, and now we're flying over on our left SAM 26,000. That is the 707 that brought President Kennedy's body back from Dallas. These transports are part of the Global Reach Gallery, and so there's the video. Let's go on to the first exhibit. So number one, obviously, the Bell X-1B. This is quite a beautiful little aircraft. This was the X-1B's purpose was doing thermal research because they knew the aircraft were going to be going faster and building up more friction, and so it needed they needed to look into how these aircraft were being heated. This aircraft has slightly different wings from the original Bell X-1. It also introduced reaction control rockets. So let's take another look here. The X-1 being carried underneath the B-29 or the B-50 aircraft to drop it and let it get started. Here's a look at those really long wings. And if you're looking there above the Air Force symbol, the little squares on the back, that is part of where the reaction jets, the reaction control jets, are located. The X-1B had reaction control jets on the wingtips that would help it with roll. They were back there on the aft fuselage to help do yaws left and right. And there was a really tiny one towards the back, right above the engine nozzles that helped it with yaw. So there it is, tucked underneath on a takeoff roll of the B-29. And for this particular aircraft, this is the second plane ever to break Mach 2. After Chuck Yeager broke it in the X-1. In the X-1B, it broke Mach 2 with Neil Armstrong at the helm. And he was also the one who tested the reaction control jets for the very first time. Now we're going to move on to one of my personal favorites in the museum. The X-3 Stiletto. What a fantastic aircraft. It's 3 times as long as it is wide, so to speak. And here we have another video of it being moved out of storage and into Building 4. those artifacts in the video were put in by the person who made the video. And I imagine they needed to find their longest tow bar that they had available to pull this off. So let's have a look at her in flight. The X-3 first flew in October of 1952, last flown in May 1956. This is a one-of-a-kind aircraft. It managed 51 flights, and Chuck Yeager was involved in flying it. Frank Everest was another test pilot that was involved. The X-3 was interesting and unique in that this was the first use of titanium in major airframe components. And the data that they gained from the X-3 figured very largely in the design and construction of the Lockheed F-104 Starfighter, as you can imagine from looking at those wings. The problem with the X-3 was that it was supposed to do a lot of wonderful things, and unfortunately, the engines that were produced for it and the engines, when those weren't going to meet the need, the engines that were put in it just could not give it the power that it needed. It was supposed to get to Mach 2, and it just never got there. So unfortunately, that's a lot of the testing that they were going for just wound up not happening. 26 total flights out of the X-3. It was underpowered. It was difficult to control. For any of you pilots out there, its takeoff speed, it needed 300 miles an hour to get off the ground. So that's quite a bit. Let's see, Frank Everest and Chuck Yeager each made 3 flights in this aircraft. And let's see, I think that's about it. This, again, is the only one of its kind. I see somebody chatted PMC, everyone. I did indeed have a plastic model of the X-3 quite a long time ago. It was I believe a 72 scale, and it fantastic little bird. I'm not sure how much room you'd have for engines, but I see Mark saying that he was able to do that. So let's get some more pictures in here. Here's one on a landing. Just a fantastic aircraft. I'm glad that we have that here. So now the X-3 was a little bit disappointing. Let's move on to another X-plane that was a little bit disappointing. The Northrop X-4 Bantam. There were 2 of these made. It first flew in 1948. The last flight was in 1954. Again, some guy named Yeager had some seat time in it, as did Scott Crossfield. The X-4 was designed to see if they could prove the theory that if you eliminated the horizontal stabilizers on an aircraft that would be, transonic or supersonic, then it would behave better in flight. As it turns out, again, that wasn't right. They never broke Mach with it. There is, let's see, horizontal tails produce shock waves, and that's when the bad stuff happens when you're in transonic flight. Chuck Yeager said, no, I'm sorry, Scott Crossfield said at Mach 0.88, the plane became unstable. It started porpoising. And if you're in the pilot seat, that's never, something that you want to have happen. So when this aircraft was eventually taken out of service after 82 flights combined between the two of them, um, this aircraft ended up at the Air Force Academy. Now, as you can tell here, let's have another look at it. This is a tiny little airplane. It was actually smaller than a Cessna 152. And what seemed to have happened is that when it got to the Air Force Academy, the students liked to move it around. It was kind of like when college students would find their professor's VW Beetle and lift it up and carry it off. They were able to do this with the X4. So eventually, the aircraft got restored. It was brought back to the Air Force Museum, and now its resting place is up in the ceiling. And that's going to happen. You'll see that a lot if you make it out here to the Air Force Museum, because I noticed somebody said that that place is really packed. That place really is packed. And in fact, if you look at some of the videos, there are video tours of the aircraft that are in storage. Even with 4 buildings, the museum doesn't have enough floor space to put out everything that they have available, even complete and, you know, aircraft that have been on display before. They've had to swap out in the process of rearranging the gallery so that they can tell, a consistent story over a small amount of floor space. So a lot of the aircraft, is the lighter ones, they can get raised up into the roof. And so that's where the Bantam is hiding now. So moving on, the Bell X5. Now this, in opposition to the X3 and the X4, which were a little bit disappointing, the X5 was wildly successful. And the X5's claim to fame is that it was the first aircraft capable of varying the sweep of its wings. It was the first variable geometry aircraft that was able to do it in flight. Now, the Germans had the Messerschmitt P1101, but that was not able to move its wings during flight. And that aircraft got captured at the end of World War II and brought back to the US. And some parts of the design and even some parts of that aircraft found their way into the X5. Um, the wings were capable, they started out with a 20-degree sweep, and then they could be swept back to 60 degrees. Let's have another look at the aircraft. And in fact, let's have a look at this, which is a multi-picture, and you can see the 20 and 40 and 60-degree sweep of the wings. This was done electrically. However, in a pinch, the pilot would be able to manually change the swing of the swing of the wings. Um, so there was a hand crank inside the cockpit to help them accomplish that. Now, the X5 was notoriously hard to recover from spins, but obviously, since we have since we have two of them, or since there are two of them that were in existence, um, one crashed in 1953 and it killed the pilot, but we have the second one. On the very last flight, Neil Armstrong was in the seat, and when it landed, it lost a landing gear door. And so when that happened, they decided to ground the aircraft. And at that point, it was transferred over to the museum. So that's the Bell X5. There it is in flight. Nice, tidy little aircraft. So now, I don't know if Frank Burke is in the room, but Frank, if you're interested, this may be your next project. This is the North American X-10. The X-10, there were 13 made. They first flew in October 1953 and they were retired in 1958. The museum's X-10 is the last one in existence. So the X-10 is, uh, it was created to help develop the Navajo cruise missile. It was going to test aerodynamics at Mach 2. It was going to test inertial guidance and avionics. It was, as you can see here, equipped with landing gear for conventional takeoffs and landings, rather than having to be dropped from a carrier airplane for its testing. It had great aerodynamics in transonic and supersonic flight. And let's have a little look at this in motion. All right, so the X-10, it was built, well, let's say from the 13 that were built, um, a number of them were flown out of Edwards Air Force Base. Then they were moved down to Cape Canaveral. Many of them were lost in flight. Two of them were destroyed in landing accidents. Some of them were even used eventually as targets, non-destructive targets, for the Bomark missile. But in any case, they um, they were all used, and the last one in existence was brought over to the Air Force Museum, and it's also there in the research and development gallery. So now let's move on to another little aircraft, the XF-92. So Convair, we've all heard of Convair. And when you see an aircraft that has a giant delta wing like that, immediately you're going to think Convair. And for that, you can thank the XF-92. This is the only one that was built. First flew in 1948, last flew in 1953. Once again, Chuck Yeager, Scott Crossfield, Frank Everest all took turns in this aircraft. And basically, it was designed to see if the delta wing shape was suitable for aircraft. The pilot is sitting down inside the intake of the aircraft. You can see the open end on the front there. Let's hop over for another view. Um, the XF-92 was assembled from the parts from a number of other aircraft. The main gear was taken from the FJ-1 Fury. The nose wheel was borrowed from a P-63 King Cobra. The engine and hydraulic systems were out of a P-80 Shooting Star, and the ejection seat and parts of the canopy were taken from the Convair XP-81. That was an aircraft that was designed, but it was canceled. Um, the strange part, the strange history of this aircraft, by the time it was ready for testing, the project was canceled. So it took them long enough to build this airplane. So the official need for it dried up. So they went ahead and tested it anyway. They learned a lot from that aircraft. Chuck Yeager was the first person to fly it. Um, One of the things that Chuck Yeager found was that the aircraft pretty much was impossible to stall because of the aerodynamics over the wing during landing at slow speeds. He just couldn't, get it to fall out of the air. He could raise the nose up to 45 degrees and it would still land at a nice, gentle 67 miles per hour. That was 100 miles per hour slower than the Convair test pilots were able to do. Now, have another little look, and then we're going to learn some strange stuff about this aircraft. It was almost in a movie, and I say almost in that um, it was filmed, not flying. It was more of a prop. And let's go ahead and change that over so you can take a look at that. Does that look like a MiG-23 to anybody? No, probably not. The movie was called Jet Pilot, and it was made by Howard Hughes. It starred John Wayne and Janet Leigh. And all of the scenes in which that MiG-23, quote unquote, appeared found its way to the cutting room floor. So they did a lot of work with it. They repainted it, and it didn't appear anyway. There was a model of it, though, in another movie called Toward the Unknown. And in reading about this, Toward the Unknown is a lot like the movie, I believe it was called Strategic Air Command, where they had film of flying B-36s, squadrons of B-36s, where it's all eye candy. But the unfortunate little XF-92 was a stand-in for what was supposed to be an F-102 Delta Dagger. So uh, close enough, right? So while we're talking about some comedic looking aircraft, we're going to go from the MiG-23 to the XF-85 Goblin. The Goblin is a wonderfully cute little aircraft. If you've heard the term parasite fighter, that's what this was designed to be. Parasite fighters had been demonstrated back in the 1930s. The US Navy had a Curtiss Sparrowhawk fighter that was able to take off from and connect back to their airships, the Akron and Macon. So this aircraft was designed to be a parasite fighter that was housed within the B-36. They would give up one of the bomb bays in order to stuff this fighter inside for, protection. It was designed so that the wings would fold up, and you can see it hanging from they called it the trapeze, and that's what they used to set it down and also take off from. And this is what it looked like hanging out of the B-29 or B-50 test aircraft. The problem essentially was that the B-36 never was never ready to accept the aircraft by the time they were testing it. And then, of course, over the span of testing it, they figured out that it wasn't the greatest of things. Um, the the aircraft was armed with 450 calibers up in the front. It could only fly for about a half hour, and then it would have to reconnect back to the B-36. In testing, the um, the buffeting from the air underneath the aircraft made it very, very difficult to link back up. So looking through here, the aircraft is 14 feet long and 21 feet wide. Um, Nicely egg shaped, as somebody commented. It does indeed look like a goonie. It had no landing gear. There were no wheels on here, so there was a rigid um, spine on the underside that would allow it to skid to a landing. There were also springs in the wingtips that let them take some of the force out of it. And that was a good thing because about half of the test flights of the Goblin wound up in, they couldn't land or they couldn't reconnect with the aircraft. So they had to do what they called an emergency landing. They would fly up to about 20,000 feet and let it go. Two Goblins were built. They first flew in August of 1948. The program was canceled in October 1949. They only managed between the two of them 7 flights. And of those, only half succeeded in joining back up with the aircraft. There were too many deficiencies um, for this to go forward. Now, one thing though that came from this is the Air Force was still interested in the idea of having, parasite fighters go along with their large bombers. So there were a number of follow-up projects. One was the Tiptoe project, Project TomTom, and Project FICON. FICON stands for Fighter Conveyor, and that one actually worked. It was a it was an F-84, a modified F-84 Thunderflash fighter connecting to the B-36, and one of those FICON F-84s is in the Air Force Museum. It's just in a different section. So the last thing on this, the XF-85 was one of the first X planes to make its way to the museum. The Vertijet. The X-13 Vertijet, there were two of them built. First flown in December of 1955. Final flight was in September of 1957. This was obviously experimental vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. Interestingly, it was part of a program to evaluate the feasibility of launching aircraft out of submarines. So there's something for you. The flight path was supposed to look like this. This is a drawing, obviously, and the aircraft would be stored on that platform or mounted to the platform and take off vertically, level out, and fly off. Let's take another look at some of the actual in-flight. These pictures of in-flight, this is the aircraft that's at the Air Force Museum. And you can see at the top of the picture on the left, at the top of that board or the platform that says Ryan X13, there is a cable at the very top. And if you look directly underneath the nose of the X13, you'll see a hook. And so that's how that basically operated. The aircraft would power up its engine, take off, and then on its way back, they would have the catch cable deployed, and the pilot would have to hook on there. The complication, of course, is that the pilot can't see that cable. There wasn't a see-through window or anything on the bottom of the aircraft, so he relied on people on the ground to help guide him in. And if you can see it on the picture on the left, there is a black and white pole that's rising up from the top of that platform. He would use that to judge his position in relation to the platform. One of the proving flights of this aircraft, the pilot actually flew the aircraft across the Potomac River in Washington and landed outside the Pentagon. So I don't know if that was a promotional stunt or whatever, but it actually did do the job. Let's see. The two that were built both still exist. One of them is, of course, at the museum. The other one is in San Diego. Yeah, the San Diego Air and Space Museum. It's on loan from the Smithsonian. Let's have one last look at the Vertijet. This is the Vertijet as it was trailered as they were putting the fourth building back together. You can see how small that little thing is. So let's move on to the Bell Textron XV3. And let's have a look at a video. The XV3 obviously is a tilt rotor, and for this particular implementation of tilt rotors, what they were tilting was the just the rotor blades. Now, the XV3's motor is there in the center, immediately to the right of the Air Force symbol on the side, and it used a common drive shaft that went up to the front, and then power was taken out to the edges. And so when they wanted to change the angle, they would, use the controls inside to change the tilt. Um, so it was successful at demonstrating the tilt rotor concept. There were two of them built. First flew in August of 1955, ended in June 1966. It had 250 flights. Throughout the testing, it performed 110 transitions from vertical to horizontal flight. And this kind of an aircraft helped pave the way for the V-22 Osprey that we all know and love now. Um, in 1959, um, Air Force Captain Robert Ferry became the first military pilot to complete a tilt rotor conversion. Um, Flight testing included, let's see, I'm sorry, I've lost track of my note there. Um, Flight testing was completed in 1959, and the aircraft was shipped to Edwards Air Force Base. Now, how we came across our XV3. In 1966, um, the XV3 was in outside storage at the Boneyard down in Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Tucson, Arizona. My dad was a F-101 Voodoo jet engine mechanic there. Shout out to Dad. Um, the the manufacturer had a team go out and recover that aircraft. It was moved to the Army Aviation Museum over in Fort Rucker, Alabama. And then, under the leadership of Bell engineers and technicians, that crew completely restored the XV3 once it was moved to their plant in Arlington, Texas. So Bell employees did the restoration of this aircraft for the Air Force Museum. So it took them 2 years to finish that restoration, and then it was brought up to Dayton, and that's where it lives today. So now, one of probably the two moments that everyone's been waiting for, and thankfully one that I'm not going to be doing a lot of talking through, the XB-70. Two were built. First flew in 1964. It was retired in February of 1969. The aircraft that we have in the museum got in 83 flights. It broke Mach 3. Its longest sustained Mach 3 flight was 32 minutes. And let's let one of the um, one of the curators at the museum tell you more.
So there were two XB-70s built only to be used for test, and they were extremely effective. They went 3 times the speed of sound, flew nearly to 80,000 feet, and the test program was very successful. Unfortunately, there was an accident in 1966 that had nothing to do with the test. It was an air-to-air collision. But the test program was extremely successful. And everything about the XB-70 is exotic. Every single thing about the XB-70. It had wingtips that drooped down to take advantage of something called compression lift. And basically the idea is the XB-70 at supersonic speed is creating these shock waves. And engineers figured out a way to harness those shock waves so that the XB-70 actually rides on those shock waves, and it generates additional lift. And the wingtips, which were alone as large as the wings on an aircraft, a smaller aircraft, would droop down and help contain that compression and take advantage of the compression lift. There was a large move in 2002, and the existing galleries were created, the Cold War Gallery, World War II Gallery, Korean War Gallery, and so forth. And the idea was to move all of the aircraft that were research and development, move them together in one place. And unfortunately, that place was on the guarded side of the base. But the idea was that when the next building was built, that then they would all move together as one unit over to the new building, rather than tear apart galleries, pulling R&D airplanes out of this one and that one. They would all come over here together. So to see the conclusion of that plan, the vision that was imagined 15 years ago, to see them come over here together and see the XB-70 move back is really very wonderful. Many of us have been waiting about 15 years for this to happen, so it's exciting. Another part of the XB-70 were its advanced engines. They were test engines. They were not production engines. In fact, there are only about 30 or so J93 engines built. It used a special fuel, JP6. And the thrust of a J93, one of these engines on the XB-70, is equivalent to the thrust on a frontline advanced fighter flying today. We've been very fortunate to be able to see some of these aircraft moving in and see this gallery beginning to form. We're very excited when we'll be able to show the public in 2016, and they'll be able to see the Research and Development Gallery, the Space Gallery, the Presidential Gallery, and the Global Reach Gallery. And the staff here is working feverishly to get to that date, and so the public can finally see these wonderful artifacts on display.
So I don't know how much I can add to that. It is simply an outstanding aircraft. And speaking of outstanding, some of us Dayton locals will remember when the XB-70 was living outside. For the longest time, it was outside at the front of the museum, and you would drive by it on your way to where people park now. Here's an example of the XB-70 with its wingtips drop down, riding those waves. Now we have to talk about the accident, of course, and here's a pretty good photo that I found. Um, so if you're looking from left to right, it's a T-38 Talon, an F-4 Phantom, the XB-70, the F-104 that would get a little too close to the wingtip, get caught in its tip fortis, and tossed over across the top of the aircraft, shearing off both vertical stabilizers. And then on the far right is the F-5 Tiger. This was done as a promotional shoot for General Electric. There are General Electric engines in all of those aircraft. I thought I read someplace that a B-58 Hustler was going to um, be added to that picture. I'm not entirely sure. I can take a look into that. And so that's the last look at the second aircraft, the second XB-70. The one that the museum has is the first one that was built. It flew to the Air Force Museum by way of the Air Force Base. And so what do you do with an XB-70 if you have to move it from one place to another that isn't connected by a runway? Well, you move it by road. In 1970, the XB-70 Valkyrie was taken down the road a ways from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base to what would be the location uh, of the new Air Force Museum. And so it had to go over Route 444 in Fairborn. People accompanied it. Obviously, you see everyone making sure that the guardrails or any kind of anything at the sides of the roads, light poles, and once you got, you have to leave the highway eventually. This is probably one of my favorite pictures that I found as I was looking through this. Um, Lifting up power and telephone cables, going through somebody's neighborhood with an XB-70. It's just fantastic. So certainly one of the crown jewels of the Air Force Museum. I have a note in here that on one of the flights in 1965, parts of the intake ramp came loose and they were ingested by the engines, and it damaged all six, and so they had to be replaced. You can only imagine what kind of job that would be. Next up, the Grumman X-29. This is one of probably the first time that a jet with forward swept wings was made. There were some prop aircraft, notably in Germany, that had forward swept wings, but this, of course, was the first jet to do that. It was also one of the first jets to employ composite materials in its construction. And we have yet another little video to watch. Any of you who've been in the Air Force before will probably recognize the main landing gear. They were sourced from an F-16. Most of the forward fuselage and the nose gear are from an F-5. So, Grumman had these parts on hand. They may as well go ahead and use them. Um, again, this aircraft was big in the use of carbon fiber composites. It had fly-by-wire for obvious reasons. And let's see, it did actually fly supersonic in level flight back in December of 1985. There were two of these aircraft built. Between the two of them, they made 242 test flights. And the one that we have is also suspended up in the roof of the museum. It's a fantastic little airplane. I remember when it was down on the ground. Now let's have a look at the Chance Vought LTV XC-142. This also is a vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, but it did things a little bit differently in that, let's have a look at it in flight. Stubby little thing, but this picture tells the tale. Instead of the earlier one that we saw where all they did was change the orientation of the rotors, this moves the entire wings. The entire wing sets go up or back to change it from horizontal to vertical flight. This aircraft was capable of going 400 miles per hour forward and 35 miles an hour backwards. This is the only one remaining out of 5 that were built, and it was flown to the museum in 1970. So again, this is one of those ones that lent itself to the design and, proofing out of the concepts that found their way into the Osprey. So now we're going to get a little more modern. This is not technically an X-plane, but I think it deserves a spot in here. This is the Boeing Bird of Prey. Now, once again, I have a video for you, and to emphasize, this is some of the stuff that the staff at the museum are doing now with their drones. So we have a video, and we'll have a look at it. You come to look at the Bird of Prey, you get the F-22 for free. And there's the Boeing Phantom Works logo. So this is the bird of prey. It was a black project. It was intended to demonstrate stealth technology. And what they were talking about there with the blended surfaces, or the gapless control surfaces, you saw the little ailerons, for lack of a better word, there on the ends of the wings. They didn't have big gaps um, in between the control surface and the wing itself, and that kind of thing um, cuts down on radar signature. This aircraft also did not fly by wire. This didn't need computers to control the flight. The pilot was able to fly it because it had commercial off-the-shelf turbofan engine, regular hydraulic controls. It was stable enough to be flown, just like you would any other aircraft. And who wouldn't give who knows what to get a crack at the pilot seat on there? That's really, really something else. So we're going to hop on now to the X-44. The Lockheed Martin X-44 is a technology demonstrator. There is only one, and the Air Force Museum has it. It has a composite structure, and its purpose in life was to show how quickly and inexpensively you could build UAVs. It is tailless, and they used it to prove out their systems and their electronics for um, remotely piloted vehicles, autonomous vehicles, that kind of thing. Um, they didn't fly it onto, but they carried it onto a carrier, a Navy carrier, so that the Navy could evaluate, what would they be able to do, or um, what procedures they would have to use in the event that they would start using UAVs for flight and landing on carriers. This was presented to the museum in October of 2020. It's another look at it, sitting next to another one of Boeing's Phantom Works aircraft. That's not in this presentation, but I had to draw the line somewhere. We're on slide 58 of 76. I had to draw the line somewhere. One ship that made it, the X-15A2. Such an incredible aircraft. Let's have a little movie about this one.
Oh, I think it's absolutely wonderful that as you say, as generations, as young kids can come in, look at the airplane and see what kind of tools were used to develop and get us to where we are today. I think that's just priceless to have a machine like this in a museum. So every flight you wanted to bring your A game when you crawled in the cockpit. Even my first flight was just exciting as heck. This could be. But things happen so fast that you really didn't have time to get scared.
So hopefully I didn't lose everybody there when I started playing around with my screen. So how do you build a wonderful airplane? Well, you start with wrecking one. This is the accident at Mud Lake in Nevada, which was this aircraft that we have is originally the X-15 dash 2. It had a hard landing, obviously, and so during the rebuild, they stretched it about 2.5 feet. They added in the two auxiliary fuel tanks, and they also covered it with, you can see in the picture, an ablative coating. Now there is a ramjet-looking construction underneath the dorsal, or um, sorry, the bottom fin down there. I'm not sure what that is. It's the XLR 99 motor. Fantastic view of that. And hanging out outside the museum. This aircraft was, Scott Crossfield had some seat time in this. It performed 31 free flights as the X-15-2 before it crashed, and then 22 free flights as the X-15A2 after it was rebuilt. And one more glamour shot for the X-15. This is where it stays in the fourth building, nicely looking over top, or looking at the Titan behind it. So that's the X-15A2. Now we're firmly heading our way into space. So let's go ahead and continue with the Martin Marietta X-24A and B. And I believe the last video on the tour here. So the X-24A and the X-24B. The X-24A is this one with the rounded body on it. This was flown 28 times, and the purpose of the 24A and the 24B were to prove out essentially the unpowered landing of the space shuttle. They were tasked with taking these aircraft up to high altitudes, giving them some power to build up speed, and then making sure that they could land without power. So there's the 24A. There it is underneath the B-52 carrier aircraft for testing. When they got the information they needed out of the X-24A, and they did some more studying, they said, let's make it look like this. And so you can see right in front of the canopy is where the resemblance to the X-24A ends. They put that really, really long nose, and from this next picture, a really, really flat bottom on it, so that it would more closely resemble the design of the space shuttle at that point in time, to make sure that they were getting the right kinds of data. They turned the X-24A into the X-24B, And so when the X-24A came to the museum, it wasn't really an X-24A. There was another aircraft that was in there called the, where was that? Um, the SV-5J. That was a model of the X-24A that was designed for flight training. And so it was modified. A few changes were made to make it look like a serviceable X-24A, and those were that's how those were presented to the museum. Now we're going to go on to the very last one that we've got here. The X-40 Space Maneuver Vehicle. So the X-40, this is the only one of its kind. First flew in August of 1998. It last flew in, well, flew, we're going to put quotes around that, in 2001, and it had 7 flights. This was an 85% scale of what would become the X-37 reusable launch vehicle. The only way it flew was being taken into the air by either a Black Hawk or a Chinook helicopter, and then it would be dropped from about 9,000 feet, a couple of miles away from the end of the runway out in Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico, and it would have to navigate its way and make a soft landing there, and it was obviously very successful. There's another look. You can see the parachutes at the back as the just in case if things went wrong. There's a picture of it being dropped from the carrier stand. And there's a picture of it landing. All of this led to the X-37, which is an orbital spaceship. Why not? Let's call it that. That the Air Force uses to deploy certain hardware and do certain other roles. Uh, as it turns out, there is one flying over us right now. The X-37B orbital test vehicle number 6 launched in May 2020, and it's still up there orbiting. So it's been in flight for about a year and a half now. So that's pretty impressive. So at this point, we've reached the end of the presentation. I want to thank everybody for attending NARCON. I want to thank everybody for stopping by the stopping by my presentation. I'm watching the Q&A section. So if you have questions, up there in the bar by your name on the right hand side of the chat window, there's a section called Q&A. If you have questions, you can put those up there. I will try to frantically answer them and find find the answers for you. I do see one where, see, last I saw the XB70 was before it moved. It was structurally in pretty poor shape. You can see them through the front windows, the 2x4s. Has any of that changed? Okay, well, I don't know the answer to that. I can reach out to the museum and find out if anything has been done on the inside of the aircraft. There was actually quite a bit of damage that was done to the aircraft, both by being outside and also by being transported. I believe I read somewhere that the front wheel struts had taken damage, and it was possible that if the aircraft were moved too many more times, potentially the nose gear of the aircraft could have failed, and so they did get that replaced. There was also a lot of There was also a lot of damage from the sun and the elements to the skin of the aircraft, and so that had to be dealt with. Um, Another question that we have here is, where is the museum? The museum is located in Dayton, Ohio. It's on the corner of Springfield Street and Harshman Road. You can see it as you're approaching. You can see all of the museum from Harshman Road. It's really easy to get to. It's open throughout the year, from 9 o'clock to 5 o'clock, with the exception of the major holidays, and it's just New Year's and Thanksgiving and Christmas. The best part about it all, it's free. There is no admission cost to get into the museum. So you can go there and spend a whole lot of time having a look around. And, if that fourth building, uh, as the name implies, is one of only four buildings. There is the earliest flights where they have one of the Wright brothers aircraft, the World War One gallery, the World War Two gallery, the uh, war in Southeast Asia, the missiles. There is so much to see there, and unfortunately, um, if any of you have been there before, you'll remember the part of the base called the Annex, or the part of the museum called the Annex. Those are the buildings from which the airplanes were being towed in the videos that you were watching. And that's where also the restoration of the aircraft happened. Unfortunately, at this point in time, because of COVID rules, they've stopped the tours that are going over there to the annex. Hopefully, they'll open that up back sometime soon. But again, as I said, if you go to the museum's YouTube page, you'll be able to see lots of drone video that will show you the aircraft and the other artifacts that are over there. One of the ones that are there that excites me the most is the Atlas missile. Again, you old timers, you'll remember when the missiles were out in front of the museum. Um, all of them but the Atlas got moved into the silo. So the Atlas is still over in the restoration hangar. I've I've been told that it won't be long until that one gets queued up and put back in place. There is a place reserved for it in the silo. So there's that. Let's see. Robert Belknap, thank you for watching. It was a lot of fun putting this together. I was having so much fun watching it. Jeff Fisher, does the restaurant still have those classy glass partitions of the XB70 etching? It does indeed. The restaurant is called the Valkyrie Cafe. From the windows in there, you can see a little bit over the grounds, but of course, there aren't that many aircraft outside, thankfully, of the museum to have a look at. But yes, it does indeed. Um, let's see, Paul Kinzer, is any maintenance done to the mechanical systems or just preservation? The general idea at the Air Force Museum is that the aircraft are going to be kept as close to their original manufactured configuration as possible. A lot of questions like that came up during the restoration of the Memphis Belle. If you haven't seen the Memphis Belle, you need to come and see it. Um, there, there isn't the intention of making any of these exhibits flight worthy. That's not the point. They're to be preserved as they were manufactured so that they can serve as source material for research. Let's see, Lawrence, fantastic. Yes, the Berlin airlift example. Yeah, you really ought to see that as well. The Berlin airlift exhibit is in between, I think, buildings 2 and 3. You pass through it, and it shows you a lot of things about how life was during the precursor, or right after World War II, and during the airlift. Let's see. Um, Bill Lindsay, picture of the XB70, the B1. Yes, the B1 Lancer is inside in the modern flight gallery. Um, There are, again, the only things that are still outside are kind of farther away. Um, if you remember where, let's see, if you're looking at the museum, it's over to the left where the big Quonset hut exhibit is. There's also a C-17 prototype that has actually been seen in a number of movies. It starred in one of the Transformers movies and some other things like that. You can check out the website to see that there. There is also uh, there's an F-15 Eagle still sitting outside. I believe it's the Streak Eagle. It's the one that was stripped down and used for the purposes of setting a lot of speed records. Paul Kinzer, can the museum be fully seen in one day? No. At least 2 days if you can. Um, Remember that it's open on Saturday and Sunday. So if you really wanted to do something like that, you could come in on a Friday, tour it on Friday and Saturday, and maybe even Sunday. There is now a hotel across the street from the museum. I don't know what its name is, but it's there and it's up and functioning. And if I can, drop another little um, piece for the Right Stuff Rocketeers, if you've ever heard of e-rockets, this is not meant to be an ad, but if you're at the museum, you are 1.5 miles from e-rockets. So something to consider. Let's see, Donald Brent, are any of the aircraft at the museum still flight worthy? It's unlikely. I don't know that for sure, but again, going back to the previous question, that's not the point. Plus, if you think about it, if you were to try to get the aircraft to a current FAA flight worthy status, you really would have to do a lot of replacement of equipment. Um, if you're talking about a really old airplane, you're talking about replacing wiring, stuff like that. It's a little it's not going to work out well for them. So there's that. Let's see, Lawrence, taking 3 days. Yeah, absolutely. You're going to want to allot yourself some time. Or, I mean, if you're a fan of a particular type of aircraft or a certain period in history, like if you're really into the World War II aircraft, you could spend a significant amount of time going through just that section. So it's up to you, but you're you're really well served to spend as much time in there as you want. You can get really close to the aircraft. It's no problems taking pictures in there. The museum is very accommodating. There are elevators and ramps. It has an IMAX theater. The IMAX is going all day long. Our good friend Randy Bodway has chimed in that it's a Quality Inn across the street from the museum. Um, haven't been there. I'll assume it's nice, but yeah, it's the museum is just an absolute gift. And if you ever find yourself in the area, I would really, really encourage you to take a trip and stop by there. If our club, Right Stuff Rocketeers, happen to be flying, you can check our website at wsr703.org. Take a look at our launch schedule, and maybe come and hang out with us. We'll fly some rockets with you. We're actually having a flight this coming Saturday. We're going to be flying high power. Bob Keplow, you'd seen the first 3 huts at NARCON. So when he was there 3 years ago, he spent most of the day in the fourth building. Totally, totally understand that. There is just so much to see. And they still have more. I could make the argument that they need a 5th building. So, maybe if we all chipped in a little bit of money, we could get that happening. Absolutely love the museum, love the people there. We also really like to have, we have a great relationship, our NAR section, with the museum. one of our club members is also in the education department at the museum. Every year we do a mass build fly in the summer. The Air Force Museum Foundation purchases the rockets and the motors, and we fly them out in the front lawn of the museum. We're flying usually Astra 3s on either A8 or B6 motors. They get 750 rockets, and last year I believe we built just shy of 700 of them, some 600 and some. And we just launch and launch and launch and launch. It's a great time. They were also very kind to us in allowing us to have the backside of the museum for one of the TARC regional sites, the TARC Championship regionals. So that was really, really handy. And they also allowed us to use the grounds for our Ohio Cup, which was a TARC qualifier event for teams that are in Ohio, which we're laying the plans for having again this year. So that's a really good time. Donald Brent asks, how many manned spaceflight exhibits are there at the museum? There is Apollo 15, which is in the Air Force Museum because it had an all Air Force crew on it. So the Apollo 15 capsule is there. A Gemini capsule is here. And beyond that, what you would consider manned space flight, you would probably have to take a look at the website to see what other exhibits there are. They have the space flight isn't really the gondola, the balloon gondolas, but there are some of those there. So that was a good thing to take a look at. Looks like my session ends in about 6 minutes. We'll go ahead and leave the Q&A open for a couple more. Beyond that, I had a really great time presenting this. Had a lot of fun doing the research and learning quite a bit about that neighbor of mine over there in Fairborn. So with that, it doesn't look like we have any more questions. You can go ahead and ask more questions. I can get with you offline and answer those. Otherwise, again, thank you. We will see you next time, and enjoy the rest of the event.